All right, welcome to the AdaptX podcast, where we have discussions with individuals who are building accessible businesses or products, advocating for inclusion, or excelling in adaptive sports. Our intention is never to speak on behalf of those with disabilities, but rather give you an opportunity to amplify your voice, ideas, and learn strategies to scale our impact and help other businesses become more accessible. Today, we're joined by Mary McManus, a mother, athlete, author, motivational speaker, and I'm sure much more. Mary, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Brendan. This is really exciting, and congratulations on launching this podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. So, to tell the story of your incredible feats now, we have to go back to the 1950s. Is it okay if I take a section of your book?
Absolutely, please do.
So, Mary is the author of the book, The Adventures of Runner Girl in 1953, which I read over the last week ahead of this discussion. She mentions that the deck was stacked against her. Without warning, on June 3rd, 1959, I dropped to the ground in kindergarten class. 3 years after contracting paralytic polio, shortly after coming out of my leg brace, my father became alcoholic. 9 years of emotional, physical, and sexual assaults followed until he died by suicide when I was 17. In December of 2006, I was diagnosed with Post-Polio Syndrome and told to prepare the rest of my life in a wheelchair. When you first got this diagnosis as a child, how did it affect your childhood?
Well, from that moment on, nothing was the same because, well, the first part was that I was initially paralyzed from the neck down. And then I started getting some movement back on my right side, but it took a very long time to get movement back on my left side. I was in a long leg brace. So basically, I missed the end of kindergarten year. And then when I started back in September, I was completely different because I was, as I call it, lugging a full leg brace that went into red polio shoes that, by the way, they have them in the Smithsonian. They were the shoes that people who contracted polio wore so that the leg brace could fit into it. So I went back to school on crutches and a leg brace. I was going for physical therapy 3 times a week, and my physical therapist was an angel. But from that point on, I really didn't have what one would call a childhood. I did have moments of very special moments. One in particular, when I went to a camp that embraced all abilities. The first summer camp I went to did not, and it was a really very painful summer. But then my polio doc referred me and my family to this wonderful camp that's still in existence today, where they really embrace all abilities, Brendan. And I had a camp counselor who was an angel, and he encouraged me to compete in the end of Summer Olympics. And I really was rather hesitant because I said, look, I really can't compete with the other kids. And he said, well, there are only 2 other people competing in the butterfly, and so you'll be guaranteed a place on the podium. And he trained me. I was terrified to jump off the starting block, and it was just a really magical experience. And he said, don't look around. He said, you're going to finish last. We know that. But the courage lies in just being out there and competing. And I did, and I finished third, and I had a bronze plaque for it. So that was a shining moment in my childhood. But overall, it was just, I was fighting for my survival growing up in a house with, my dad was alcoholic, my mom was addicted to prescription pain medication. So what I did to survive, Brendan, was I honed my intellect. And that's how I got through, and kind of just left my body behind.
Yeah. Did I read in the book, were you valedictorian in high school? Yeah. So how did your physical disability affect your schooling experience or your intellectual development?
Intellectually, I was completely intact. And I worked very hard to really hone that. I mean, I'd be up in the middle of the night studying. I had a chalkboard in my room. I'd write notes, and I became obsessive compulsive about my schoolwork, but it enabled me to survive. And it was the one area where I received positive feedback and I felt some self-esteem. And fortunately, I had some wonderful teachers. But as far as gym class, just forget it.
Yeah, well,
It was
academics probably also you were able to kind of control your own destiny, whereas your polio diagnosis took some of the physical capacity away. You weren't able to. You had more control and ownership over your for your academics. So I'm sure that was empowering.
absolutely. That's a very good point, Brendan. Yeah. So it was the one place where I could succeed, excel, and you're right, having control because with my body, I was very, very blessed with a physical therapist and a physiatrist who specialized in the rehab of polio patients. So that was vital, and I'm so grateful. He made sure that I didn't end up with scoliosis, and they did everything they could to get me to walk again and to be able to function at my highest capacity despite the damage from the polio virus.
Yeah, and you say that counselor encouraged you to kind of swim your own race, and in your book, I believe you thank Dave McGilvery for giving you the opportunity to run your own race. So that seems to kind of be a theme, and it's a theme in inclusion and adaptive sports in general. Like do the best with what you have, and when you can do better, do better. And that's I think that might be a Maya Angelou quote, but that just is, it seems to be a sentiment that's pretty consistently echoed, kind of in my industry or in my world at least.
Yes, and I'm so excited that you're going to be putting out that book because that's a theme in the book, about how you can enable everybody, if you're putting on a road race, to be able to shine and to be the best they can be, and not be concerned with running another person's race or having to. And the most important thing is that they can excel in their own way. And that's one thing that I learned throughout this journey and through the sport of running is that I'm not competing with anybody else. It's just me. And a lot of times that's worked to my disadvantage when I start going after PR, which is how I blew out my knee in 2014 now. But be that as it may, it's just really a joy to be able to be a part of this incredible community.
Yeah, I think all of us are guilty of that with running. Once you start getting times in your head, it's hard to dial it back in, and it's so like a quantitative sport. You can either run a certain time or you can't. So it's like become fixated on these things. But it was super helpful to read your text as I was editing the book because like your lived experiences kind of gave me a different perspective as to how I could accommodate maybe some of the runners that were moving a little slower. So like you and I had talked about one of my concerns with our past race this past June was I wanted everyone to kind of start at the same time. But then it kind of ended up that some of our slower runners that took 75, 80 minutes to do the 5K, people were already kind of leaving by the time they finished. So I was like, well, that was kind of anticlimactic. So maybe, like you mentioned, like maybe giving them that half-hour head start so they can still get the celebratory nature of finishing with crowds and congratulatory. And like some of those stories were like the best of my participants, like someone post-stroke doing his first 5K. And we kind of missed some of that stuff because we had them all start at the same time. So I think it's definitely a great idea to give people the opportunity to start a half hour early if they choose to. So. But it's kind of like, I guess, with inclusion and universal design, it's just giving people the opportunity to make those decisions, not making the decisions on their behalf. So at least giving them the capacity to start early if they want to.
Yes, absolutely, Brendan. And that's, I was really, when I ran the Boston Marathon, I was really, really anxious about the 6 hour time limit. And I talked to our team coach at Spalding, and he said, "Wait, aren't you getting an early start?" I said, "What? What do you mean an early start?" And now, of course, Brendan, the regulations are very different for early starts and also for mobility impaired runners. So I feel very blessed that I had that opportunity to run Boston because the regs have changed since then, but be that as it may, we got an early start, and it was the best thing that could have happened because I was out there with the field. And if I wouldn't have, I would have missed the experience that is Boston. And have you done Boston, Brendan?
So Jacob and I just qualified about 2 months ago. So my Team Hoyt duo partner and I, so we ran the Martha's Vineyard Marathon May 20th this year, and we finished in 2 hours and 55 minutes, which qualified me for my age category. So Jacob and I will run this April, so we're looking forward to it.
How exciting. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness, that's great.
Yep. So I know they do waves, right? So it's mobility or it's hand cycles, push rim, mobility. Are they all grouped together or are they separate?
Now or then, when I ran it?
When I guess yeah, I guess when you ran it.
Yeah, so in 2009, we started with mobility impaired. And then the push room, everybody else started after us. So we went off first. And I remember seeing Ernst van Dyke whiz by me, which was really thrilling because he was the captain of our Spalding team. For people who may not know, Ernst van Dyke is 11 time now or 12, I'm not sure, but yeah, and he was the captain of our team for Spalding, and he gave us a speech at our pre-race dinner, and he said, "A disability doesn't end a life; it's just a new beginning." And it was really a thrill, to be out on the race course, and then Brian Hall passed us, and all the running greats, and you're like, "Oh, I'm out here." And I said to our coach Dominic, who got me the early start, I said, "Well, what do we do when they start?" When the crush of runners come, like, do we have to go over to the side? Like, what do we do? And he said, you have every right to be out there just as much as they do. So you just do your thing.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the Van Dyke quote because actually, when I read it in your book, I was also at the time working on a presentation on like models of disability, so like the medical model of disability versus the social model versus charity model, and I actually took that quote from Van Dyke that you included in your book and I added it to my slide deck because that's like the charity model is kind of like you have someone with a disability and you have their support staff, and the person with the disability is meant to be pitied, or you're supposed to feel bad for them and you're supposed to praise the support. And that's always like, that was actually kind of one of my early experiences with inclusion, was it always kind of felt weird when I was being like praised for coaching Special Olympics, or I was being like praised for being a peer buddy and best buddies. Because to me, it was like you're kind of marginalizing the people I'm working with by saying that like, oh, I'm so nice for being friendly to him. It always just felt weird to me. So it was Ernst Van Dyke's quote on his lived experience of his life beginning after disability is a really important concept to like communicate to people, that not all disabilities are perceived poorly by those with disabilities. And for many people, their life changes drastically after for the better.
Oh, I would, you were asking about my childhood, and on the one hand, oh, it would have been nice to experience what a, normal childhood is like, whatever that is, Brendan, by the way. But having said that, I wouldn't trade that experience for the world because I wouldn't be the woman I am today. And the same thing with the diagnosis of post-polio syndrome. I would not be who I am today had I not had that life-changing diagnosis where I discovered so much about myself. I started writing poetry, and I now have this incredible message for people that you're not your diagnosis. And, so often, Brendan, people take on their diagnosis. And it's such a blessing that, you work with people who've had these different things happen to their bodies, because they discover strengths that they never knew they had. And I take issue with the message that I received, and I really hope and pray that the post-polio community and also other progressive neuromuscular diseases really change their philosophy. There was a philosophy of, if I used it, I would lose it. And that was so counterintuitive to what I was experiencing. And Initially, I needed to conserve energy. I had to go back into a leg brace. I had to use a cane. I did have to leave my career because the stress was too much. But on the other side of it, I was so blessed that I didn't stay at the post-polio clinic at Spalding because I found an incredible earth angel of a physical therapist at Spalding downtown near my office who said, no, you don't have to spend the rest of your life in a wheelchair. Let's reconnect the mind and body. And she was phenomenal. I'm still friends with her today. She has a private practice up in Maine. So that's such a powerful purpose for me now to be able to say, okay, you were given this diagnosis. It looks grim. I had difficulty swallowing. I had difficulty breathing. The lymph from polio returned. They told me I needed to go on oxygen at night, and I took the leg brace because that helped to ease and conserve some energy and get me back on the path. But the sleep apnea machine, no thank you. I did go on a semi-soft diet because I was aspirating food into my lungs. But then I eventually, through harnessing the power of the mind-body connection and also doing some of the suggestions, like I was on a semi-soft food diet and I had to do a chin tuck when I swallowed. And I did all that initially. And then I was like, wait a minute, I cannot embody the person that I am today. And that's where writing poetry came into play, where I started visualizing something very different than what I was actually experiencing. And I knew about the mind-body connection from Dr. Bernie Siegel. Are you familiar with his work? Oh, he's incredible, Brendan. He talks about the power of the mind-body connection and how we can heal. And he gives an example, and this is what really inspired me after the diagnosis of post-polio syndrome. There was a woman named Evie McDonald who contracted polio as a child, and then she was diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And she decided that she wasn't going to die hating her body. And so she started sitting before a full-length mirror in her wheelchair, and she started loving every part of her body. And she started visualizing, and she started connecting with her body. I think she also was an abuse survivor. And she's one of the few documented cases of complete remission from ALS. And hearing that story really inspired me to start loving myself, to caring for myself. And I was blessed to not only have the physical therapist, but a personal trainer who believed that she was working with a Parkinson's patient who was 20 years older than I. And she said, you are way too young to not be able to get off a couch or the toilet seat without assistance. So I've been very blessed with the people I've met.
Between your initial diagnosis at 5 and the diagnosis of post-polio syndrome at, was it 53? Yeah, what was that 48 years like? Was post-polio syndrome on your radar? Did you notice yourself kind of like progressively losing motor function or anything? Or kind of, I guess, what encouraged you to seek out that diagnosis?
So no, I didn't know about it. The first time that I heard about the post-polio syndrome diagnosis, I had reconstructive leg surgery. What happened was after I had twins, my left leg, which was the more affected polio leg, started to bow, and so my knee was bone on bone. And the surgeon that I was blessed to come across, Dr. Don Riley, when I went to see him, I had seen him for some other issues. I said, what are we going to do? I'm in a lot of pain. He said, well, you're like 38 at the time. You're way too young to have a total knee replacement, so I can offer you a femoral osteotomy. And so he corrected my leg. He corrected the bow in the leg, and he realigned the whole leg. He was also an electrical engineer before he became an orthopedist. So he developed this, which was really cool. So anyway, I'm there for my post-op visit, and this is so true to form, Brendan. he says, McManus, we had a great relationship. He said, I need you in the office. I said, well, is it my appointment time? It's a little early. He said, no, I need your help. Long story short, there was a woman in the office who had post-polio syndrome. Her husband was a veteran. He needed to do corrective surgery on her and to ease her pain. And he needed me to find services to take care of her husband because she was the caregiver. So that was the first time I heard about post-polio syndrome. And I never really thought about it, excuse me. And then I started feeling not well. I noticed that I was extremely tired. I was in a lot of physical pain, and I just felt I was getting weaker and weaker. And I had no idea what was going on. I'd be at the VA, and in between patients, I wondered, am I having a stroke? Because I actually had numbness and tingling, which was from a disc pressing on a nerve in my cervical spine. And so finally, after about 10 years, I said, okay, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. I need to figure out what's going on. And I Googled post-polio syndrome. And that's how I was led to Spalding. And I do want to say, I am so grateful to them because I did take my first steps on my healing journey there. They did offer a lot of compassion and support. I had occupational therapy. I learned a lot about energy conservation techniques. But they could only take me so far because of their view of what post-polio syndrome was all about. They didn't believe in neuroplasticity or that muscles and nerves can actually reconnect.
I wonder if that's changed. I wonder if they've kind of made a universal change towards that approach or whether it's still consistent. Is there still a post-polio clinic there?
There is. And I actually, interestingly enough, one of the physical therapists there, my husband and daughter hired as a personal trainer. And he was great in terms of getting them back into running initially. My daughter had a health care concern. And so he was great getting them back. But when we were at the, what was it? The Providence, Rhode Island half marathon, and he was there to cheer them on, and I was there to cheer them on. And I could tell from talking with him that they're still very much in the cautious model, because he even said to me, and God bless him, Brendan, I'm not being judgmental or anything because people don't know what they don't know. But he saw my journey, but he said, have you thought about using walking sticks? And I was like, why would I use walking sticks? I mean, I want to get back to my running, and he meant well. But so he's a physical therapist there, and I know the physiatrist there, when I went back after my knee injury in 2014, now we're 9 years post that, but when I went back after I blew out my knee, he told me I should never have started running. I should stop running. I was going to need a total knee replacement. So, but I'm hoping maybe somehow, some way, that they will, that they will change their stories. And also, too, Brendan, the mindset of a polio survivor is, we really felt victimized by the disease, the way it happened, and also the way society viewed polio. So it was a hard mindset to overcome. But yeah, my hope is that at some point they're gonna make that shift.
Yeah. You mentioned in the book having an initial conversation with a doctor who kind of attributed your symptoms to like PTSD and like kind of that's all in your head.
Yeah.
What was that like? And then maybe can you juxtapose that to like the validation of receiving a diagnosis? Like was having a label to it useful?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I did suffer from symptoms of post-traumatic stress. There's no two ways about it. But I needed something a lot more. And it was so validating to have somebody say to me, listen, your body is experiencing the residual effects of having contracted childhood paralytic polio. And these are some steps we can take. The difficulty swallowing was very alarming. And to have a speech therapist do a swallow test and to say, those muscles are deconditioned, and that's why you're aspirating food into your lungs. Here's what you can do to bring some relief. So yes, the fact that there was something very real going on in my body that could be addressed, and something completely separate from the polio, which is something that the physiatrist discovered at the post-polio clinic, was I had a disc pressing on a nerve in my neck. And he sent me to a cervical spine doctor who, to this day, I call my master magician. And I had trigger injections. And that was causing the tingling sensation into my face, down my arm, and also the severe radiating pain. And so it was like, oh my God, there are like things we can do to help the body to heal. So yes, it was a tremendous relief.
It's probably an interesting kind of like proposition though, because you finally get that diagnosis, which is very reassuring, but then you're then connected to all of these professionals who kind of put limitations on you because of that diagnosis. So it's kind of, I guess, I don't know, it's a positive, but then there's also to a degree a negative component to it. And there might be some people who, when they might take all that medical advice verbatim and not explore any alternative methods. So I wonder kind of what the best approach towards addressing that is. But
No, that's a very important point, Brendan, because initially I immersed myself in the Western medicine model. And even after I blew out my knee, I went back for a minute to the Western medicine model, and then I was blessed to find a chiropractor. So I think, and I went back in 2014 because I needed to know, okay, what's going on in my knee joint, what's going on in my leg. And one of the things that the physiatrist said to me was, well, the MRI shows that your gastroc muscle is gone, it atrophied from the polio. There's nothing we can do about that. Well, fast forward to meeting this incredible chiropractor who said, well, you can do gastroc strengthening exercises. We're going to use KT tape, and you can actually grow a new muscle. We don't have to stay stuck with the notion that it's atrophied and it's gone. And you see this a lot in your work, I'm sure, in terms of especially stroke survivors, right?
yeah, it's been some tough conversations where I don't want to put limits on what their recovery is going to look like. And it's beyond my scope of practice to predict those things anyway. I'm just a personal trainer, strength and conditioning coach. But like when I sometimes hear one of them say like, "Oh, when am I going to be able to do X, Y, Z? Like, is this ever going to be back to quote unquote normal?" Or they commiserate that they're frustrated that they have to do all this exercise and rehab. And I just try to tell them like, listen, everyone has to exercise to stay healthy, whether you're doing rehab exercises or you're immersed within a traditional group class. Like, it's just part of being the healthiest version of yourself. And we try to just look at how function's affected. So we identify a specific goal they want to work on. So for you, it was running the marathon. For one of my clients, it's he wants to ride a bike across the country. So it's
Oh,
like,
wow.
what are the skill sets and what are the physical qualities we need to be able to bike across the country? And it's improving his cardiovascular health. It's being able to stabilize on a bike for long enough. It's not necessarily that he might have some hemiplegia and one of his hands are affected by his stroke. Like, that's obviously relevant, but it doesn't necessarily have to prevent him from doing and achieving that goal. So it's like you were referring to the Western medical model, and we compare that to like the social model of disability, where someone's not necessarily disabled by a specific impairment, but more so by an environment that doesn't account for their differences or like a lack of support in the right ways. So that's just like a perspective we try to communicate with our coaches is you need to understand the diagnosis because that's going to influence how you train someone, but it's not necessarily the impairments that are present in the person that's preventing them from like accessing our gym. It's how our gym is structured that needs to accommodate them. So That's just a perspective that I think it kind of needs to be carried forth to make like all businesses more inclusive and accessible, I guess.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, that's critical. And so often too, the first race, 5 mile race that I ran. Well, the very first race I ran was a neighborhood race, the Cora Pub, and that was, so friendly, and everybody was celebrating the fact that, oh, this is my first road race, and little did I know, I thought, all races are like that. Well, then I got to the Marathon Sports 5 miler, and it was an evening race, and it was very hot, and we had trouble finding the race because it had moved, etc. So everybody it was a very fast field, Brendan, and they all took off. And one woman said, "Oh, I'm not going to be last." And I was beside myself, and it was an evening race, and I was still in the very early phases of, getting learning how to run basically, and I was crying and I was sweating, and I didn't know like where the tears ended and the sweat began. My husband stayed with me. My daughter went ahead because she wanted to run her race, which was great, and also there was one woman who made some snarky comment, and so she took off, and she got her Irish up, if you will, because for mom anyway. But my point here is that you know the my mindset during that time was, what am I doing? I don't belong here. And fortunately, when I crossed the finish line, Marathon Sports knew my story because they fitted me with my first pair of running shoes, and they celebrated me like I broke the tape. And they blew the air horn, and fortunately there was staff still out on the course. But had they not known my story, had they not kept the water stops open, had the volunteers left, it would have been a total disaster. And I don't know if I would have had the courage to go on and train and run Boston. So you're absolutely right. It's so important.
I mean, endurance sports have the capacity to be probably the most inclusive and accessible sport there is. Like, there's really nothing that would prevent someone from a wheelchair competing alongside you, competing alongside me. Like, I think it's just when you're designing a race or when you're trying to put together an event like this, just understanding all the different situations, and like you said, making sure that water stop stays open, making sure there's people to celebrate the finish, like giving everyone the same treatment and the same opportunity to experience like everything that running provides.
You also said something very important earlier, Brendan, about, everybody has to exercise and train. And one of the things that I felt early on was that I knew I was going to be in pain. With post-polio syndrome, there is a lot of pain that's involved. And I decided early on that if I were going to experience pain, I'm going to experience it on the side of healing and health, because there's pain of atrophy. And a lot of what I was experiencing early on was the pain of atrophy. And so it's so important for people to make choices for themselves, and everybody's different. But I know for me, I knew there was going to be pain. So
Yeah,
why
and
not do it?
not to diminish that experience in any way, but like I think you'd be hard pressed to find anyone training for a marathon that doesn't experience some of the highs and lows of pains.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's like, and I think Jessie in the first podcast we recorded, when she was like talking about the immediate time after her accident, and she said, "Oh, there's good days and bad days, but people without a spinal cord injury have good days and bad days too." So it's like, how are you going to respond to those bad days? So those are the messages that I think we really want to kind of perpetuate and communicate to people.
Absolutely.
'Cause
Absolutely.
that gets away the victim mindset.
Yeah, and you know what, there's no separation between the life that I live, having experienced polio and then having been diagnosed with post-polio syndrome, and somebody who hasn't. There are struggles, there are highs, there are lows. I'm slower, absolutely, but you made such a good point. And I think so often, we tend to separate and segregate. And and categorize. But in truth, we're all on this journey together, and however it comes up for each individual person. But certainly don't look at me and say, well, you've had this disability or whatever. And you asked a very interesting question of Jessie, which is, how does she feel about somebody saying you inspire?
I was gonna ask you the same question.
Well, that ties into this because I think a lot of times, oh my God, you lived through all of that. You're such an inspiration. And, Jesse said it so well. And I felt the same way. I was like, yes, that's how I feel. I want to be an inspiration. And yes, I inspire myself. I inspire my daughter. My daughter inspires me with her journey. And we all inspire each other. My husband's now 71, and he's going to be running he ran the trilogy of half marathons with my daughter in a year for a fundraiser. But my point is that, we can all inspire each other. I love being inspirational to other people. I just think it's so important that we have sheroes and heroes, and that people say, oh my God, she lived through that. And Dave said it Dave McGilvery in his review of my book. Then she lived through all of that. What's stopping me from being the best that I can be? So, yeah,
Did
it's a
you
joy being an inspiration.
did you have any representation? Like, was there anyone else with post-polio syndrome that you kind of like looked up to, or that you saw accomplishing great things?
Well, I just got goosebumps. Not post-polio syndrome per se, but Wilma Rudolph is my shero. Do you know who she is?
Nope.
So she had polio, and the doctor said that she would never walk. And her, I don't know how many siblings she had, Brendan, but they all came and they massaged her legs, and her mother prayed and said, you will walk again. And not only did she walk again, she started playing basketball, and then she went on to track and field, and she won 5 Olympic gold medals.
Oh, well, I don't know how
So,
I don't know how I haven't heard that name then. But
oh, you should Google her.
yeah,
My
absolutely.
personal trainer, I had a really tough run, training run for Boston. And I said, oh, Janine, I don't know how I'm going to do this. And she said, you're going home and you're Googling Wilma Rudolph. And I did. And I still get goosebumps thinking about that. So, yeah. But it's interesting that I don't know any other post polio people who are out there. I do have friends with MS who are doing epic things, Parkinson's disease, but I don't, in terms of representation for post polio. But for polio, Wilma Rudolph, definitely.
Do they present in a similar way, post-polio and MS and Parkinson's?
Yes,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah. And especially with the message of progression.
Yeah. 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 My dad was
So,
diagnosed with MS when I was in kindergarten, but he has had a really good and fruitful 21, 22 years since that diagnosis. But I know that's not always the case for every case of MS. We have a couple of clients with MS, and their disease has progressed in various ways. And I guess similar to other diagnoses, it might depend on the location of the lesions and the size of the
yes.
lesions. Do you know what the diagnostic process is for post-polio syndrome?
Well, it's a diagnosis of exclusion. So there's actually no, like with MS, they have the MRI and they look for the plaque. I'm not sure how they diagnose Parkinson's, but so that's MS Parkinson's. And for post polio, it's a diagnosis of exclusion. So they did extensive lab work, I mean, 8 tubes of blood, to rule out any other possible causes. The only thing that came back abnormal was the muscle function test in the blood work. And then they also used something called an EMG, which they really need to find a better way because that's Have any of your clients had EMGs?
I'm sure they have in some capacity. It's not something we've talked about closely, but
Well, it's really awful because what they do is they test your nerve to muscle function and they zap you, and then they turn up the zaps and it was awful. They did it in my upper body, and so they discovered that there was no gross effects of late effects of polio in my upper body, but I wouldn't let them do my legs. And on clinical exam, it was apparent that there was a lot of weakness in my lower extremities, left greater than right. So, but those are kind of the diagnostic tests, and then it's based on clinical exam as well as presentation of symptoms.
is there any medicine intervention for post polio?
Interesting question. One of the things that they wanted me to take was called Artane for head tremors. And interestingly enough, my tremors have gotten much, much better because of the meditation. I think because of the exercise, because of, just really being convinced that I can transform these late effects of polio. So I started the Artane and it made me really sick to my stomach. So then they said, well, we can do Botox injections. And I said, no, thank you. I'm cool. I can live with this. So there are some medicines that help with fatigue that they also use in MS and whatnot. But, I'll take a nap.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but yeah, our some of our clients with CP use Botox effectively, as well as one of my clients with an SCI. But it's really different for everyone, and everyone responds differently to the medication. So my dad was
Yes.
on I guess they're all kind of experimental interventions because there's no necessarily like a cure for MS, but when I interviewed another adaptive athlete who has MS, she said that she never tried anything. And then one of my clients tried the same medicine that my dad takes, and it didn't work for her. So I guess it's a series of trial and error, I suppose.
It is. It really is. And my friend with MS who does epic stuff, and she's actually going to be running the Hawaii Marathon, and she's run Boston for charity, and she does the Reach to the Beach and just does all this incredible stuff. She actually had some IV infusions that were extremely helpful to her. And then she saw a chiropractor who specializes in MS, and that also really helped her as well. And I think, whatever the best of East and West, and or whether we call it East or West or holistic or whatever. But yeah, I think it's putting together the best of what's going to work. And for me, I just found that side effects of medicine were more harmful than any potential benefits for me. I know for some people, as you mentioned, like the Botox was great. So I think whatever people can find on their healing path, use any and all of it.
Did your diagnosis affect your career path, or I guess how do you think your childhood influenced your decision to go into social work?
Oh, that was absolutely. I was healing myself while I was healing others. And I majored in public relations, and then I worked at the BU Counseling Center and doing their public relations. And the director said, "You have a real gift with the students who come in here." And he said, "I really think you should go into counseling." And I said, "Oh, you mean I need counseling?" He said, "No." He said, "You should become a counselor." So the quickest route was social work. And I worked initially with adolescents, and that wasn't a good fit. And then I did some inpatient psychiatric work and then ended up at the VA. And in terms of my career path, I I had to end it with the diagnosis because I needed to take care of myself. And they also said the OT, the occupational therapist, and the physical therapist, even my angel of a physical therapist who said you're not going to end in a wheelchair, but she put me on a biofeedback machine and said, look at what the stress is doing to you. physically, and then you've got the emotional stress. And I couldn't push my veterans around in a wheelchair any longer because I needed one. And so I knew it was time. And I always said, Brendan, that if ever there were the day that I could not give my veterans 100% and their families, that I would leave. So I was 3 years shy of retirement, but I took out my whole retirement account, which actually was a godsend because then the market crashed. So I had my retirement account, and I took that leap of faith and said, I've got to heal my life. I've got to take care of me. But I do cherish the memories from when I was able to serve those who served.
Yeah, absolutely. I we hope that the audience for the podcast is, I mean, anyone really, but a lot of the work that we do is more within the fitness space. And you mentioned in the book having an angelic personal trainer. And I was curious kind of what characteristics made her so effective for you, and like how that can be applied by other people in the health and fitness industry.
Oh, that's a great question, Brendan. Well, the biggest thing was I met her through a friend, and we were actually talking about her in-home personal training business, and this business Networking International that she belonged to. And so we were talking about how I could promote. I had a little greeting card business when I left the VA. We were talking about my business, but in the back of my mind, I thought, I wonder if she can help me. So she said, because I was so bored with my repetitive exercises from Spalding. And so after we got through talking about this Business Networking International, I said, do you think you could help me? And her response was from Henry Ford: whether you think you can't or you think you can, you're right. So right off the bat, I was like, okay, that the fact that she believed that people can get stronger, that people can go farther, and the fact that she said to me that I was too young to not be able to get off a couch or get off of the toilet seat without assistance, or that I needed a tub chair to take a shower, or to use my leg brace and a cane to be able to walk, and not even to be able to enjoy being in my physical body. So she held that faith for me, which was fantastic. Total non-judgment. When she did the initial assessment, I couldn't pass it. And, she did the BMI, she did everything. No judgment whatsoever. She said, okay, this is where you are today. We've got our baseline. And then 6 months later, and she worked with me, and she just the faith that I didn't have to be that deconditioned was a very, very powerful healing force for me. And she also gave me things to do in between sessions. And after 6 months, we did the initial assessment again, and I passed it. And that was really exciting. And she asked me what my next goals were. Now, probably this is extremely unique. I'm sure most personal trainers might not have had the same reaction that she did when she asked me my next goals. And I said, maybe take a dance class because I took ballet as a child. I want to come out of my leg brace. I just want to take a walk outside and feel free in my body. And she was writing everything down. And I said, I need different exercises. I get bored. I think most people do. And so she was getting ready to leave. And I said, wait, I have one more goal. And I just said it. I said, I want to run the Boston Marathon. It didn't go through my head. It fell out of my mouth from my soul. And it was just something that I felt called to do. She could have said, Mary, you've never run a day in your life. You're in your leg brace. Why don't we start out with a 5K? And she said, you're going to need a pair of running shoes.
It's like holding people to high expectations, and also catering things to their specific goals and not just your biases, I guess, as a trainer.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and Brendan, that's crucial. Not having a bias, don't judge. you know, she didn't say, well, you don't have a runner's body, or, you can't run, or any of that. She just had total faith. And she had coached another person who did not have any physical challenges, but she coached her. She'd never run a day in her life. And this woman went on to run the Boston Marathon. And so the fact that she did have these wonderful expectations of mine and was able to embrace that. And then she also trained my husband and my daughter, because they said, you're not going to do this alone. They also didn't think I was really going to do it, Brendan. It was sort of a, oh yeah, well, wink, wink, we'll go along with you. So those are very important qualities. And also just her caring, her compassion, and she had a great sense of humor. And the first time she took me on hill training, we have a huge hill in our neighborhood. And I said, wait, I think it's too soon for hill training. She said, you're going to have a lot of hills to run. And she said, let's just do it. And at first, there were times when I wondered, was she pushing me too hard, too fast? But then I realized I was training for Boston. So she engendered a sense of trust in her judgment.
Absolutely. And I wonder what has to be changed to raise people's expectations of those with disabilities. That's where I think, like, that question I asked Jesse, like, do you like being inspirational? I guess maybe the root cause of that question in my head is that I think sometimes people with disabilities doing kind of rudimentary tasks gets praised and goes viral, and it inadvertently makes people expect less of someone with a disability, because people are getting praised for doing something pretty basic. Oh, that must just be the baseline. So that's where it's like walking the tight line of like an inspiration narrative versus someone doing something actually inspirational like you. It's like, how can we recondition the general public to expect more? Because that's where I think one thing we do pretty well is we treat all of our clients, whether they have a disability or not, in the same way. We hold them to high expectations. We cater programs to their specific goals. But I don't know if that's commonplace, but I wonder what has to be done for it to become more common.
Well, one of the things as I mentioned to you when I gave feedback about the book that's going to come out, is that when you hold somebody to low expectations, first of all, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But the other thing is, I was in a class at Spalding, and I don't even know how I found my way there, but it was for people who had challenges that were far greater than mine. But it was also the way, like, it wasn't, okay, so, oh, Mary, you look like you could do this, and making it an inclusive experience rather than addressing the needs of the people with the least ability at that moment, because it's always changing and growing. But I think it is a mindset. And I think the biggest part of that mindset is to see capability, is to see possibility. And what's the worst that happens? So somebody doesn't achieve their goal? Well, what is it, shoot for the stars, aim for the moon, you'll get a star, or whatever. But that's what it is. Like, what's the harm in failure too? And how do we even register failure? But I think, what it is, Brendan, I think the core thing that needs to change in Western medicine, in the way things are approached, is fear. I think, and that's where Jessie really addressed that, when she talked about when she went back to being an orthodontist assistant. And, she talked about how, yeah, sometimes something would happen with a patient and I'd go in, I'd change my clothes, so what? But she's out there and she's doing it. And I think that fear factor, I can't begin to tell you the messages of fear I received. You need a cane with an ice grip, because if you fall, you're going to fracture your hip and then it's all going to be over. And I'm like, well, guess what, guys? I had several falls while running. None of it on the ice, by the way, but uneven pavement or whatever. I had one fall while training for the Bermuda Half Marathon. It was in summer and there was a tree root. And I landed like I did a face plan, my knees, my hips actually hit the pavement. Now, I was told that I had osteoporosis and that, basically there was nothing they could do because bone density doesn't come back. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it does. But anyway, and again, we're not giving medical advice. And I know that's very important, Brendan, a big disclaimer. This is my story. But I think we need to take the fear factor out of things because truthfully, what's the worst that can happen? And so what? If I went out, I fractured a hip, it'll heal. The body has tremendous capacity to heal and to grow.
Yeah, and it's like normalizing disability. The more people see your story, the more people that listen to Jesse's story, the more they'll just begin to recognize disability amongst the like general public and stuff, and they just see it as another characteristic of an individual instead of something that should segregate them.
Yes. Oh, that's perfect. Yes, segregation. That was the word I was looking for.
Yeah. I think I would love to wrap up with this quote that you have in the book. You say, "I can no longer be a slave to my past. I'm running my own race. Each training run is an opportunity to learn more about myself, mind, body, and spirit. Every race where I finish last reminds me to celebrate who I am, to celebrate my courage, faith, determination, and to let go of arbitrary measures of success." I think that purpose perfectly encompasses a lot of the things that we're after. We want to give everyone the opportunity to run their race or participate in an activity that they love, that they're passionate about. And hopefully these conversations can begin to kind of change the narrative a little bit, demonstrate to people what individuals with disabilities are capable of doing when they have the right support system in place. And maybe it will encourage someone to be that support system. So someone else in your situation can benefit from their guidance and their help. So, Mary, we really appreciate you coming on today and sharing your story. We'll definitely link to your poetry and your books in the show notes, and as well as your personal domain, your website as well. We hope wherever your running journey takes you next, you have an incredible experience and you meet fantastic people like you discuss in the book. That's been my favorite part of being involved with the running community. It's just the people that I've met over the last 7 or 8 years. It's really a sport unlike any other, I think.
Absolutely. Well, actually, we're heading to Bermuda in January. I took a hiatus after running 3 halves in Bermuda and had a setback in 21 and 22, but the comeback is always greater than the setback. So my next running journey is going to be in Bermuda in January. So thank you, Brendan.
I'll be following along. Thank you for listening to the AdaptX podcast. Our effort to amplify the ideas of our guests and create more inclusive and accessible industries is futile unless these episodes reach a larger audience. If you enjoyed our discussion today, please leave us a rating or a review on whichever platform you use. And if you would like to learn more about AdaptX, the course that we teach to health and fitness professionals and the projects that our organization is working on, you can subscribe to our newsletter through our website, www.adaptx.org. Until next Monday.